Welcome to the September meeting of the Society. A special welcome to any guests tonight, and I can see a few faces here I haven't seen before. Knock your watch off here. It gives me much pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniella Rose as our guest speaker tonight. Daniella is a lecturer in Italian in the Department of Language Studies in the School of Humanities at Flinders University. Her research interests include Italian immigration to Australia, with a particular focus on the maintenance of culture and ethnic identity of Italian communities in South Australia. In 2008, she and Professor Desmond O'Connor, who was her PhD supervisor and a lecturer, completed a book on the migrants from the town of Calonia, is that right? Calonia, in southern Italy. If you don't know where Calabria is, it's the sort of the foot, almost the toe part of the Italian boot. Daniella and Professor O'Connor are currently writing a book on the history of the Italians from the town of Molfetta, who settled at Port Adelaide and still comprise a significant proportion of the Italian community in that township, or suburb, I guess, these days. Daniella's topic tonight is Calabrians in South Australia, the history, traditions and ongoing connections. Thank you, Daniella.
Thank you very much for coming tonight, despite the... Can you hear me? Yes. Right. Thank you very much for coming tonight despite the weather, and I hope that my presentation will be very interesting and make it worthwhile for you to come down here. Jeffrey was saying my presentation tonight will document and explore the history of the presence of the Calabrian community in South Australia in the context of Italian and Calabrian migration to Australia, both before and after the Second World War. It will also examine the level of cultural maintenance in relation to socio-cultural customs such as engagements and wedding practices. And within a transnational framework, the presentation will also focus on the cultural and emotional bonds that the Calabrians still maintain with their place of origin, Caulonia. And I will have a map and show you where it is. And they maintain these bonds both at community and at individual level. And we will look at the influence that these ties have on their cultural identity. But first of all, I would like to give you an overview of Calabrian migration in the context of Italian migration to Australia. Italy is quite a young country because it achieved its unification in 1861. Before, it was divided in a lot of different states and was dominated by foreign powers like the Bourbons from Spain in southern Italy. And by the unification in 1861, there were about 220,000 Italians who were living abroad. But by the end of the 19th century, Italians were leaving their homes in search of a better life at an average rate of 300,000 a year. And just before the First World War, this figure climbed to as high as 872,000 departures in 1 year. A huge number if we consider that at that time, Italy's population was of about 30 million. The principal overseas destinations were the USA, Argentina, and Brazil, and other European countries, especially France. The majority of the migrants were young men, especially from rural areas, who migrated either alone or with few other companions. They turned to migration as an alternative to poverty and felt a strong drive for adventure, hoping to fulfill the dream of making a fortune in another country, a dream that could not be fulfilled in their own homeland. Until 1919, the number of Italians who migrated to Australia was quite insignificant compared to the other countries we saw before. It represented only the 0.25% of the total migration flow to overseas destinations. And this was because the Americas and the European countries were closer and more enticing. There was no direct passenger shipping between Italy and Australia before the First World War. And the Australian government, first colonial and then from 1901 federal, had no desire to encourage Southern Europeans to settle in the very British monocultural Australia of that time. 2/3 of those who did make the journey to Australia were from the northern regions of Italy, and 1/3 was from the southern regions. Most came through chain migration. The initial pioneer, adventurer, once had successfully settled in Australia, brought his relatives and friends, first mainly the young males from their hometown in Italy, and subsequently it was, if all went well in Australia, their wives, fiancés, and children, and finally their elderly parents. This chain migration had an enormous effect on creating in Australia a relatively narrow geographical composition of the Italian migrants, because they originated not only from specific Italian regions, but also from specific towns and villages in those regions. And that's why we will see Caulonia in this context. So I'll give you an overview of the Italians in Australia. In 1921, there were 8,000 Italians living in Australia. By 1930, by the 1930s, the number had more than tripled, with half of the Italians settling in the cane-growing areas of Queensland at first. This rapid increase in Italian immigration, which was partly the result of this disastrous economic legacy left by the First World War, and partly because of the introduction in the USA of a severe quota system, was viewed with alarm by the Anglo-Australian society. At the end of the Second World War, there were just 33,000 Italians in Australia. The federal government embarked on a massive immigration program, which in 1951 led to the signing of an assisted migration agreement with the Italian government, whereby Italians would be given financial assistance towards travel expenses, provided that they had the required labor skills, were no older than 35 if they were men, and no older than 45 if they migrated with their family. Women could not be older than 30 if they were single. Under the agreement, Italian applicants were screened for their suitability. In the post-war decades, only 1/5 of the Italians who arrived in Australia entered through the assisted migration agreement. The other 4/5 were sponsored by family or friends who already resided in Australia and who often helped to cover the cost of the journey by ship. Overall, between 1947 and 1976, as many as 360,000 Italians migrated to Australia. Italians became the second largest group of settlers after those born in the United Kingdom. At the 2006 census, about 200,000 Italians were recorded to be in Australia, and over 300,000 spoke Italian in their homes, and over 400,000 people declared to be of Italian background. So this is a representation. Of these 200,000 Italians in Australia, about 11.3% are in South Australia. And but I'll summarize a bit the history of Italians in South Australia first. When 2,500 Italians resided in the state at the end of the Second World War, but by 1971 they increased to 32,000. Most Italians settled in South Australia did so because they had been sponsored by an already established relative of paesano, someone from their own village. At the 2006 census, and you can see the slide, there were about 22,000 Italian born in South Australia, more than 90% of whom reside in the Adelaide metropolitan area, and about 17,000 speak Italian at home, and 47,000 claim to have Italian background. half of the Italian migrants originate from 3 specific Italian regions. Campania is the first, the most represented, Calabria, the second one, and Veneto. Chain migration has meant that they came from specific towns, as we said before. In the case of the Calabria region, the migration flows have originated mainly from the towns of Caulonia, Sinopoli, and Plati. If you are of Calabrian descent, you might know where these towns are. The Calabria region, in fact, has always been one of the largest sources of Italian migrants in Australia, both before and after World War II. And here you can see a map of Calabria. As Jeffrey was saying, it's the tip of the boot of Italy. And if this works, and that's where Caulonia is. In the interwar period, Calabria was one of the poorest regions of Italy. In the 30s, its rural economy was based on age-old agricultural practices and characterized by underdevelopment and overpopulation. At the end of World War II, Calabria was still one of the poorest regions of southern Italy. Despite the input of funds from the government through the Cassa per il Mezzogiorno, the Italian government after the war set up a state fund for the south to help with its development. But despite this, the Calabrian economy continued to be characterized by agricultural underdevelopment with very limited opportunities for unemployment. For employment. In 1976, there were 47,000 Calabrians in Australia, and Calabria was the second largest source of Italian migrants behind Sicily. There is still a very high unemployment rate in Calabria today, and young Calabrians still tend to move to other Italian regions, especially to the north regions. Migrants from Calabria represented the highest percentage of any other Italian regional group in New South Wales, in Western Australia. In Victoria, the Calabrians were the second largest group behind the Sicilians, and in South Australia, they were the largest group behind the migrants from Campania. South Australia has been one of the main recipients of Calabrian migrants both before and after World War II. Between 1927 and 1940, a quarter of the Italians who arrived in South Australia were from Calabria. And due to the chain migration process, these early migrants were instrumental in sponsoring their relatives and fellow townsmen to South Australia after the Second World War. Most Calabrians settled because they already had a paesano who had settled here, and in the post-war period, over half of the 36,000 Italians were from Campania, Calabria, and Calabria. Of these Calabrian migrants, about 13,000 were from Caulonia, which is the Italian town that is most represented in South Australia in the Second World War period. Caulonia is a small Calabrian town in the province of Reggio Calabria with a population of about 7,000 people, and the urban center lies upon a triangular rocky outcrop 9 kilometers from the Ionian coast. The Ionian Sea is the sea that you can see there, and Caulonia is about 9 kilometers from the seaside. But why did I choose to study the Caulognese? First of all, because my supervisor convinced me to, and secondly, because we thought that was a very important study. Because the Caulognese migration is particularly interesting because of the large percentage of arrivals in South Australia, and also because the Caulognese in Adelaide are a visible and enterprising Italian community with a deeply rooted attachment to their birthplace. They form a very close-knit community interested in the maintenance of their customs and traditions, and are known not only among Italians but also in the wider Australian society because of their commitment to aged care. They've just opened a nursing home in Seaton. And do we have any Caulognese here? Yeah, we'll be able to say that what I'm saying is actually true. It is also an Italian community well known in South Australia for its devotion to their patron saint, centenarian. And also because there were not other comparable studies, and they are really keen to maintain their traditions. Colonia, this is just another aspect of Colonia, is a small town of Greek origin situated 9 kilometers from the coast, and for centuries agriculture has been the primary means of subsistence of the whole town. And its underdeveloped economic resources and high unemployment rate have induced thousands of Colognesi to migrate in search of a more dignified future. Colonia has been deeply affected by the migration phenomenon. Its population halved between 1921 and 2005, dropping from 14,000 to 7,000. And I'll just give you an overview of what I was looking for in my research. I've wrote my doctoral thesis on the Colognesi as well as a book with Professor O'Connor. And my research objectives were to compare the experiences of 3 sample groups. So I interviewed the Colognesi who settled permanently in Australia, not only in Adelaide, but I went to Mildura and Perth, and I also interviewed some Colognesi from Melbourne. And then I went to Italy and I interviewed the Colognesi over there, the Colognesi who had migrated to Australia for a certain period of time and then returned. And also I interviewed some Colognesi who did not migrate. So I had 3 points of view in my research. And what I was looking at was especially the maintenance and transmission of their traditions, especially in relation to the family values, engagement, and wedding practices, the ongoing connections between the Colognesi communities in Australia and Italy, at a community level through their religious practices, the celebration of their festa, of Saint Hilarion, their reciprocal group visits, their Saint Hilarion society, and their nursing homes. And at the individual level, I was looking at the reciprocal visits. Because recently, the most recent studies in migration consider migration not simply as a process of departure and settlement in the new country, but they also take into account the bonds, the ties that the migrants maintain with their homeland, considering that in the present time the connections between these diasporic communities and those who stayed behind or returned are intensifying due to improved forms of communication and increased frequency of reciprocal visits. And these are some of the basic principles of translationalism, which provide the framework for my study. And Glick and Schiller said migrants are embedded into multiple social fields, linking their country of origin with the country where they have settled. And migrants maintain enduring ties and develop social networks with their home country. They stretch across national borders even when they are geographically distant. So the migrants are, in a sense, closer now than they were in the 50s when they came, because they can go home more frequently to visit their families over there. They've got Skype, they can see each other, they call each other, so they maintain and increase their bonds with their homeland. The methodology that I used, as I said, I collected my data from 3 sample groups. They were all first generations, and they settled permanently in Australia. I interviewed 92 migrants in Australia. 22 migrated in the 20s, in the interwar period, and 70 after World War II. 59 were interviewed in South Australia, 13 in Western Australia, 20 in Victoria. And I interviewed 19 returned migrants. 1 of them migrated to Australia in the interwar period. And then I interviewed 15 Colognesi who never migrated. 69 of them were men and 57 were women. So I was very pleased because I had almost an equal number between men and women. So the stories of the women were were also represented equally in the book and in my thesis. And now, this is just a family photo because it's relevant to the fact that the concern for family well-being, which was the main drive for many Calabrians to migrate, shows how important the family has been and still is for them. Structurally, the Calabrian family in Australia is a nuclear family consisting of father, mother, and dependent children, but is characterized by strong ties and contacts with relatives. According to most of the participants of my study, this was also the structure that characterized the Calabrian family in Italy before migration. In Italy in the past, apart from meeting in specific circumstances such as birthdays, name days, engagements, weddings, baptisms like this one, Christmas and Easter, the family also used to get together when physical help was needed for slaughtering the pig, for harvesting the wheat or picking the olives. They all used to help each other. Today, the Calabrian family in Adelaide still maintains the same high degree of social cohesion through frequent family gatherings. Lots of the interviewees said they still meet on a Sunday all together to share the Sunday lunch. Christmas, Easter, and birthdays are usually spent together, and regular weekly and at least annual gatherings are also organized. Sometimes the migrants from Perth come here to Adelaide. They have family reunions that really stretch across the continent. Sometimes their relatives from the United States come here as well. Although most of the Calabrians who live in Colonia still similarly meet at least once a year with their relatives, it is apparent that today in Australia the extended family is more close-knit than in Italy because of the busy Italian lifestyle that prevents family members from visiting one another. So the family in Australia has maintained a higher degree of cohesion compared to the family in Italy. And then I will look at the engagement practices. The ritual of the engagement has been much modified by Australian practices over the years. While in the pre-migration past it was celebrated in a similar fashion by the Australian and Italian Calabrians interviewed, today the engagement practice is more highly regarded by the Calabrians living in Australia than by their counterparts in Italy. In the past, the ritual leading to the engagement was quite formal and included all the members of the two families. If a man wanted to become engaged to a woman, he could not ask her directly because he was not allowed to speak to her. He had to talk about his intentions to his parents, who would then in turn ask the woman's parents, who sometimes would ask their daughter's opinion and sometimes would decide by themselves. I interviewed quite a few women who said that they married the men their family had chosen for them. If the engagement was arranged, a festiciola in familia, a small family party, was organized, and most of the interviewees in Adelaide and in Colonia remember that during the period of the engagement, the two fiancés could not talk to each other, much less sit next to each other. Today, in Australia, engagements are usually larger and more formal than the ones that are celebrated in Italy, and they involve the participation of a few hundred people, family members and friends, and hiring of a hall for the reception, the handing over of the engagement ring, and the exchange of expensive gifts. But in Colonia, the engagement ritual is gradually disappearing. Indeed, today it is very rarely celebrated. On the few occasions when it is celebrated, it consists of a very intimate meal celebrated at the house of one of the fiancé's parents and does not include the exchange of gifts, but only the presentation of the engagement ring. So really this practice has been modified by the Australian traditions. The difference in size and importance of the celebration in Australia perhaps reflects the need of the migrants to display symbolically what they have acquired in Australia, like prestige and wealth, which compensate for the poverty from which they escaped. As one informant observed, here the engagement is celebrated in the overly luxurious hall. It's a show-off. Everybody tries to outdo the other. Wedding celebrations Two have undergone significant changes over time. This is a photo of a wedding in Italy. One of the trends that has changed the most is the age of the bride and groom. It was once common for young women of 16 or 17 to get married to older men between the ages of 20 and 40 sometimes. And the tendency of the Calabrian families in the past to marry off their daughters at a very young age can be ascribed to two main reasons. One of an economic nature and one of a moral nature. As was the same case in Sicily, in Colonia it was customary for families to marry older daughters before the sons to avoid economic hardship. If the sons married first, they would have deprived the family of their earnings and left the parents with daughters who were not major wage earners. The other reason was linked to the concept of honor. The earlier the daughter married, the less the parents had to worry about preserving her purity. This was a big section of my study, but I had to select what to present tonight. So the informants I interviewed reported that in the past in Caulonia people tended to marry other paesani, mainly because nobody traveled in those days and they did not have the chance to meet people from other places. The marriage ritual was generally divided into two parts. There was a civil celebration and also a religious ceremony, followed by a small reception. The wedding ceremony used to include, and still includes, il compare dell'anello, who hands over the rings, is like the best man, and 2 or 4 witnesses chosen by the bride and the groom, who do not dress up in any particular fashion, but wear an outfit of their own choice. I don't know if you've ever been to an Italian wedding. So we don't really have in Italy the bridesmaids and the groomsmen, just witnesses who wear whatever they like. The bride in the past did not necessarily wear a white dress, but the best dress she had. And one of the informants reported that since her mother did not have enough money to buy her a new dress, she was obliged to get married at 4 o'clock in the morning in order to avoid the gossip and criticism of the other paesani. That was very moving when she was telling me this, because she was almost cried remembering this, her wedding, which should have been a very happy occasion for her. Other participants recalled that when she married in 1938, she was one of the first brides in Caulonia to wear a white dress, because she was the daughter of l'Americano, a migrant who had already made some money in the USA and had the financial means to buy his daughter a nice white wedding dress. It was common practice for the paesani who had migrated to the USA to send back to Italy wedding dresses that were subsequently altered for the local brides. Between the 1930s and the 1960s, wedding receptions in the Caulonia township were organized either at the home of the bride's parents or at the hall of the local parish. Refreshments consisted of pasta alla crema, cream pastries, and rosolio, which is a wine that was still made in Calabria, and is used especially for weddings. And the refreshments were followed by il ballo, the dance, and the attendance at the reception held at the parish was always larger than the one that took place at home, but rarely exceeded 100 guests. Presents to the newlyweds usually consisted of small household items or natural products like salami, olives, and cheeses. All the informants, now I will talk about the weddings in Australia. All the informants interviewed in Adelaide indicated that over the years, the wedding ceremonies in Australia have been modified by local practices, as we saw for the engagements. They described the marriage in Italy prior to migration as simpler, less expensive, and characterized by lower levels of guest participation. Italian weddings in Australia usually involve a religious celebration and are characterized by expensive bridal gowns, the hiring of a sala, the wedding venue, and expensive gifts. Today, Italian-Australian weddings have incorporated the British tradition of having bridesmaids and groomsmen groomsmen, who have to wear elaborate outfits, usually chosen by the bride. Receptions are normally held at a hired wedding venue and attended by between 150 and 450 guests, including family members and other paesani. The extreme wedding that I can remember from my interviews was someone who married just after the Second War in the 50s, and she had about 750 guests. They actually, some of them used the Adelaide Showground for their weddings as well. And it was a community event. It wasn't just a family, but it was a community, because it was chain migration. So they all knew each other, and they invited all their relatives and all their paesani. Many informants in Australia described these marriages, di lusso, lavish, and as rituals that have become an occasion to show off the wealth and the respect that they have acquired in Australia. This attitude is not only a one-sided concern on the part of the marriage makers, but also a social obligation felt by the participants themselves, who are generally expected to give a gift of a certain value. The importance of the opinions of the other paesani as regards wedding receptions and the financial value of gifts show that the Calabrian community in South Australia is a very locally oriented one, and much concerned with the question of bella figura, of the public image. And the need to fare bella figura, and the concern with what people might say about one another. This doesn't only apply to the Calabrians, but to most Italian communities, and even in Italy there is this concern about la bella figura, to always be well regarded in the community. I've got another photo of an Australian wedding, and this would never happen in Italy. You would never have all the bridesmaids wearing the same dress. So the adherence to Italian family values and traditions has influenced parental attitudes towards de facto relationships and inter-ethnic marriages of their children. The majority of the Calabrian interviewees living in Adelaide admitted that they would have found it very disappointing if their children had left home before marriage, and they regarded it as a relief when they didn't. There is also, I'm talking about this, we have to keep in mind that my study was based on first generation Calabrians. So some of these stories go back to the post-war period, so they don't really apply to the second or third generations here in South Australia today. So back then there was a very low rate of intermarriage between the Calabrians in Adelaide and the Anglo-Australians or other people of different ethnic backgrounds. In the small number of cases where the children had married non-Italians, most of the parents usually claimed that in the beginning they were not very happy. They would have preferred some Italians for the language and for the traditions, but then they became happy because they realized that the people, their daughters or their sons married, were good people. So it just took a little bit of time to appreciate different cultural backgrounds. Now, then I analyzed the weddings in Italy as well, and we have to consider that in the last 3 decades, Italian society has undergone deep cultural changes. The South, even if at a slower pace than the North, has been affected by industrial development, which has brought improved material quality of life and acceptance of more open and modern models of behavior and attitudes. One of the most profound changes in the Calabrian attitudes regarding wedding customs is the acceptance of the convivenza, the de facto relationship. All the people interviewed in Italy admitted that living together before getting married is becoming increasingly more accepted, even by the older people, whereas it's not so much accepted here still, from what I understood. In addition, in Colonia, people tend to marry at an older age compared to the previous generation. Men and women are usually 30 or older when they marry, because before getting married they have to go to university, or they choose to go to university, and then they have to find employment. There is also the tendency to marry people from other towns or regions, because young Calabrians today travel a lot for pleasure, work, or study, and they have the chance to mix with people from a variety of places. Today, in Caulonia, the marriage ritual still involves a civil and a religious celebration, followed by a reception, usually held at a restaurant, with the number of guests varying from 60 to 300. So it doesn't really reach the magnitude of the Australian weddings over there. And due to the expense of the meal, there is a common tendency to make up for the cost of the lunch by giving a gift, usually money, of the same value or higher than the value of the restaurant meal. This is a calculation that they consider. Yeah. Most interviewees regretted the intimate and familial tone that used to characterize the weddings of the past. So they actually looked at their weddings in the 50s, and they wished that they were still similar to those today. Now I'm going to talk about the festa, because the Calabrian community has also recreated here in Australia tangible signs of their identity through the celebration of their feast, the religion festival, in honor of their patron saint, Saint Hilarion, which is coming up in October, and which is a bridging tradition and an annual renewal of the feeling of belonging to their birthplace. The Adelaide Festival of Saint Hilarion began in 1955 and was one of the first Italian feasts in Adelaide in the post-war period. It was initiated by a group of 4 Calabrian migrants who wanted to introduce in Australia a tradition from their hometown. To strengthen the religious ties with Caulonia, members of the local clergy, and this has included the local bishop, have sometimes been invited to Adelaide. Social ties have also been maintained through visits by the mayor of Caulonia. In fact, is actually here as we speak. There is a big celebration. He just came last week to celebrate with the Calabrians the opening of their nursing home in Seaton called La Casa di Sant Hilarion's house. So this is actually very current. And the Calabrians have always organized group back to Caulonia. And what I analyzed, I really wanted to know, how do they feel when they go home, when they visit their town, their family, their friends. And during one of these visits to Caulonia, the leader of the Australian Calabrian delegation said, and these are some images of their... have you been to the Saint Hilarion Feast? It's celebrated at Mother Christie in October, around the 21st of October. And one is the feast in Adelaide, the photo on the left, and the one on the right is the feast in Caulonia. So they're very similar. And they also brought a statue with them that was made by a local artist. So when this group of Calabrians went to visit Caulonia, that's what he said about his feelings during the visit. We don't feel Australians, we don't feel Italians, but confused. But perhaps it is more accurate to say that in this particular moment we feel like swallows returning to their nests. What is certain is that we all feel a very strong attachment to Caulonia. For us, our village represents everything. Every square, every street, every corner reminds us of our childhood. This is evidence that suffering never ceases for a migrant. So that was his. That's what he was saying during the visit. And now this is just a summary of the visits that occur between the two communities, the one in Adelaide and the one in Caulonia. So mainly they are linked to the celebration of their annual feast. So first the feast was organized in 1955, and then in 1969 the Society of Saint Hilarion was founded too. And it was founded to promote the devotion to Saint Hilarion, to gather annually in October to celebrate the feast, to promote social, sporting and cultural interests and activities. They have like pasta nights or music nights, cabaret nights they used to organize in the 60s. And it's in the case with other Italian associations, for the Calabrians, connecting with the Society of Saint Hilarion means belonging to a clearly identifiable group. And this has distinct advantages because the contact is renewed and strengthened with both relatives and friends when they meet, and they can feel that companionship that existed once in Colonia. The club, the Society of Saint Hilarion, also provides opportunities for remembering and sharing similar past experiences. So when they meet, they remember what they used to do. It's also a tangible expression of oneness, which is demonstrating through preparing Calabrian food, eating together, dancing, celebrating together special occasions such as Christmas and Easter and Carnevale. I don't know if you've been to the Carnevale, but they always have a stall at the Carnevale and they sell the zeppole, for instance. I don't know if you've tried them. It's an occasion for them to speak their dialect, to maintain the local customs and traditions. And the aging community finds comfort and enjoyment spending time with their own age groups in these nursing homes. I mean, one of the problems that is going to affect Italian community already, and even more so in the future, will be the aging of the community. And there are nursing homes that provide service and staff that can speak the dialect. So what happens is that some of the Italian migrants, when they age, they revert to their own dialect, and they find it really difficult to communicate. People can find advice and assistance of a professional nature, and like example, medical or legal or business contacts. And also, this is something that they try, and hopefully they will succeed. They try to encourage the participation of members of the younger generations, and they want to share with them their traditions and way of life. But usually, sometimes it's quite hard for them to involve the younger generations in their the organizations of their feast and so on. So that will be also another problem that they will have to face in the future. But the Saint Hilarion Society has developed beyond its initial scope and has become known among the other Italian communities and in the wider Australian society for the contribution to aged care. In the late 1980s, 3 nursing homes were built, and now the Society has amalgamated 2 of the original facilities to build a new one in Cetos, as we were saying, that was officially opened last Sunday. And apart from these prominent links, so these are the links that the migrants still have with Colonia at a community level, but I also analysed the links that the Calabrians had at individual level. And in recent times, thanks to improved forms of communication and increased frequency of travel and of reciprocal visits, and also because they have greater financial security, both in Italy and here, these connections between the migrant community abroad and the Calabrians in Italy have intensified. And I identified different types of visits in both directions, their length, their frequency, and the difficulties that were associated or are associated with the visit. In terms of the length of the visit to Colonia, the migrants I interviewed said that they usually go there from maybe they stay there 2 days or up to 6 months. The most common length is about 4 weeks when they go. The migrants who own an apartment in Colonia or choose to rent one while visiting seem to visit more regularly and for a longer period compared to the migrants who rely on the accommodation offered by their relatives and friends. So if they have an apartment there, they tend to go more often. the frequency. The shortest length of time spent abroad before visiting their hometown was 4 years, and the longest 57. So I interviewed a person who hadn't been back for 57 years. The improvement in travel technology and its increasing availability and affordability have influenced the frequency of the visits, of course. When people had to rely on costly and time-consuming journeys by ship, visits were infrequent. Today, plane travel is more accessible and visits have become more frequent. Now, with the purpose of the visit, I have a graph, maybe will be, I don't know if you can read, but I will show you what are the purposes of the visit. I identified a number of different reasons. The most common one, of course, was visiting family, which is the first columns there, the highest ones. It was the principal reason why the migrants visit their hometown. And the return migrants and the non-migrants visited Australia. They come here because they want to see their family. Visiting family and sightseeing, due to the greater affordability of travel, there has been also a rise in visits to family members. They also incorporate visits to the major cities, like elsewhere in Italy, so like Rome or Florence, or even in Europe, like Paris and London. And that they only had heard of at the time of their migration. So when what I noticed is that when the migrants go back, they go back to visit their family, but they incorporate these visits, these sightseeing trips to other European capitals or Italian big cities. And they also visit their hometown to maintain cultural ties. These visits are justified by the wish to reconnect with the place, and these are undertaken by migrants who don't really visit Caulonia very often, maybe once or twice in their lifetime, and are undertaken to reconnect with the place, with their village, with their identity, by participating in special religious festivals, especially in honor of their patron saint, Saint Hilarion. So they choose specifically to go there in October to take part in the feast. And many Cauloniese migrants are also pleased to show their hometown, and indeed their old home, to their Australian-born children. That's a very important reason why they go back, to show where their children, where they came from. Then there are also some visits that are undertaken in times of crisis in either direction, and of course they involve the need to care maybe for a new member of the family, usually the parents who maybe have remained in Italy, or in the case of return migrants, a family member who is still living in Australia. Ritual visits are motivated by key life cycle events like weddings. They go back to participate in a wedding or a honeymoon or special birthdays. And business visits, which involve maintaining professional contacts. They were quite low. This have occurred only among some visitors from Australia, but they have not really been very common. And the group visits have been particularly popular among the Italian Cauloniesi. This is from Italy. What I noticed is that they organize big groups. There have been a few in 1997, in the year 2000. There has been another one for the opening of the Saint Hilarion home, and probably they do this because they are reassured to travel in a group, and also because they have a limited knowledge of the English language, so they feel reassured if they travel in a group. But also, I mean, these are all the reasons why they visit. I also analyzed why they don't visit. And the main reasons, as the slide shows, are lack of family ties. Two of the migrants in Adelaide who've never visited Caulonia said that they have never returned because their relatives had died and they didn't have any reason to visit. A couple said that they used to visit regularly, but now their parents have passed away, they no longer go there. The visit home is also perceived by some of the migrants as a reminder of the hardship that they had to endure before migrating. So they don't want to go back and remember the hardship they had to endure before coming to Australia. One woman, for example, who's never returned to Colonia since her departure in 1951, said, I've never gone back to Colonia. I don't want to return because it would remind me of how difficult life was once before I came to Australia, when I had to carry bundles of wood on my head, pick olives, or go to the river to do the washing. So some migrants really choose not to go. I wanted to see how do they feel when they go there, what kind of difficulties or challenges do they encounter when they visit. So I interviewed these migrants, and they said that one of the main difficulties was coping with the less familiar environment, because the experience of a trip to Italy enables the nurturing of a link between this home and the memories of the past in Colonia and the home and life experiences of today in Adelaide. So old friends, now older relatives, familiar buildings, streets, sounds, smells are not quite the same as the migrant's memory of them. And it is not unusual for the visitor to feel alienated in his or her hometown. So what they imagine, what they remember here is not actually what they find when they go there. And furthermore, some of the non-migrants interviewed in Colonia observed that the visiting migrants hoped to find tangible connections with their past and were disappointed when they saw how much the environment in Colonia had changed. One non-migrant said, most visitors asked to be taken to visit the places where they used to live before migrating, so they could remember their childhood and youth, but they felt a bit lost when they saw how much the urban landscape had changed. So they really feel a sense of displacement. Not only the surroundings are different, but also the relatives and friends had changed beyond recognition. It was an emotional experience for many to realize that often, after so many years abroad, dear friends and family had either passed away or changed in such a way they could not be recognized. Also, when they go home, they after the initial happiness of being reunited with their loved ones, both the migrants and the non-migrants realize that they are quite different, that their life experiences have brought about profound changes, especially in relation to attitudes to family, as we saw before, society, cultural traditions. This awareness of being different when it occurs sometimes generates great disappointment in the visiting migrants who still identify with their hometown. One of the consequences of being a migrant is that their identity sits between two worlds. On the one hand, in the adopted country, Australia, they might feel and be perceived as different, especially when after many years they find themselves being labeled Italian or ethnic. Or on the other hand, when they return home for a visit, they might find that they are unable to merge into hometown life. The visitors sometimes discover that the Calabrians who never migrated are protective of their present-day Calabrianità, and they hesitate to welcome them as former members of their community. There are cultural differences too, especially in terms of the maintenance of old customs and beliefs, attitudes to everyday and formal dress, social interaction, language skills of the Australian Calabrians. Only briefly, if I still have time. Do I still have a bit of time? No, it's almost, I'm almost finished. The difference, I will only make a point on the language skills and social interaction. The difference in language skills is used by the Italian Calabrians as a, to identify the cultural differences. All the Calabrians spoken to in Italy noted
with some amusement, that the language used by their visiting relatives was different from their own. Firstly, they noticed that the migrants used a mixture of English and Calabrian dialect. And secondly, the dialect they spoke was old-fashioned, and lots of the words they used were no longer current in the dialect spoken in Caulonia. So there is even almost a language barrier when they go back. And most Italians now, especially the younger generations, they all speak Italian. Unfortunately, they don't speak much of the dialect, whereas the younger generations here, they still speak the Calognese or Calabrese or Veneto dialect or a Sicilian dialect. Conversely, the visiting migrants considered the preference of the young Calognese in Italy for speaking standard Italian rather than Calabrian dialect a loss of their ethnic regional identity, which is still highly valued in Australia. And they said, we have remained Calognese, they haven't. The difference in social interaction, I might just skip this point, because otherwise we might not have time for questions. I might just conclude, make just some conclusive remarks. So the Calognese Australians interviewed in Adelaide displayed a very strong attachment to their ethnic origins. They manifested their ethnicity through value systems, rituals, and traditions that they brought with them at the time of migration. In Australia today, the social context is much more tolerant of ethnic diversity compared to the past, when assimilation was expected. As in the case with other Italian migrants, the Calognese, rather than feeling pressure to abandon their unique traits of identity, today they tend to feel encouraged to sustain their cultural diversity by reinforcing and reaffirming their culture. Some of these pre-migration customs, like the centrality of the family, have retained to a great extent their original traits. Others have been, over the years, adapted to the Australian local practices, as we saw the engagement and the wedding practices. And it is clear that compared to the pre-migration period, changes have occurred in the Calognese traditions in both countries, and that both the Calognese in Italy and those in Australia have been influenced by their present-day experiences. The Calognese in Australia have modified their cultural practices to a varying extent by adapting to, and in some instances adopting, the culture of Australia, while the Calognese in Italy have adapted to the economic and social changes that Italy has undergone in the last few decades. And Calognese have also maintained a strong connection with their hometown. The bonds are most noticeable and significant at the time of the social and religious functions and during the two-way visits of individuals and groups who travel from Australia to Caulonia and vice versa. To be Calognese in Adelaide means belonging to a clearly identifiable group. The Society of St. Hilarion, like other Italian town and regional associations in Adelaide, offers some of the advantages that are derived from a physical return to Caulonia, and is able to function as an halfway house between the old world and the new. Attachment to birthplace remains deeply rooted in the psyche of the Calognese. For them, as for other migrants who settled in a foreign land, the physical return to their origins assists in confirming and reinforcing their identity and heritage, and provides the opportunity for renewal and deeper understanding of self. We all change over time, places change, who we are is inevitably bound up to our past and our roots, but also influenced by our day-to-day experiences. And in the case of the Calognese migrants, their Italianità and Calognesità is a continuous process of transformation. I just would like to conclude with a metaphor that one of the Calognese I interviewed told me to describe the relationship that he feels with this homeland. I love my mother and I love my wife. I used to live with my mother, but now I live with my wife. Italy is always my mother, and when I can, I visit her, but I always return to my wife and my family. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
I have a question about proxy weddings.
Oh, yeah.
A number of where Ian and I grew up in Paradise, Italian next door neighbours who had a market garden organised a proxy wedding for the son, and I wondered if you could tell us how it was done. You know, was it an Australian civil wedding or an Italian civil wedding or both? Or
yeah. Yes, that was actually, as I said before, I had to be selective. I think probably I've already spoken too much with the material I had. So there were parts of my thesis that I had to leave out because it was a big volume. And the proxy, with the weddings by proxy, were a part of my research. So the way it was done is usually because these young single men came to Australia, and of course because of the imbalances of the gender imbalances, they used to write to their relatives in Colonia and say, I would like to get married. So they arranged, the family in Italy used to arrange the wedding, and could have been a brother or an uncle was the proxy. The girl actually went through, there was a celebration of the wedding, and instead of the groom, there was either his brother or a member of his family. So they had the celebration, so they had the civil and religious celebration, and then the girl would leave Italy and come to Australia, and then sometimes she would have another celebration here in Australia, but not all the time. It depended very much on the family. So the main celebration was actually in Italy, and was a member of the groom's family that would be the proxy groom. So yeah, it was a quite moving experience because some of them, especially in relation to their age, as I said before, the Calabrian women were really quite young, and they came here and they realized that they were married to men who were maybe 20 years older than they were. So.
Daniella, would she travel by herself?
Yeah, well, yeah, sometimes they did, yes, and the reason why, the reason why they were married first before leaving was really because the family didn't really feel comfortable to allow the girl to travel such a long distance without being married. But what happened is that usually there were not only two people living. There were always groups of people, of paesani living all together. So they were all traveling together. They were not necessarily from the same family, but they all knew, or there were other proxy brides from Sicily, because from Colonia they used to go to Naples or Messina, and then they would get on the ship. So they were always traveling with other Italians and sometimes other proxy brides or paesani. So they were not, in a sense, by themselves, but they were not necessarily with members of their own family.
You've told us about engagements and weddings, but not about death, funeral, memorials. Do we need you to come again, perhaps, do we?
No, I haven't actually looked into those aspects. Yeah, maybe that would be a good research project.
You can't interview the deceased.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I didn't really feel comfortable, I suppose, but I mean it would be worthwhile. I know some of the members of this Calabrian community have a grave in Italy, like a family grave, and I know a person showed me a video. Sometimes if a paesano passes away here, has passed away, they video the funeral and then they send it to Italy or vice versa. And also what they do in these Italian towns, they always have like funeral notices, or when it's a year that the person has passed away, they put like obituaries, I suppose, or around the town. And they do that even for their paesani here. So if someone passes away here, in the walls around the town of Caulonia, you might see the name of the person with the funeral notices and everything. Yeah, there is. I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, even I analyzed these bonds that they keep with their hometown, and certainly there is a bond in that respect when for funerals and deaths as well, definitely. But I haven't researched it in depth at all. So maybe it could be my next project.
I know absolutely nothing about proxy weddings, except I have heard of them happening. Are proxy weddings recognised legally both in Australia and Italy?
Well, when the paperwork, I mean, the celebration was done in Italy, so there was the religion's celebration, but also the civil one, so that involved all the paperwork, and that paperwork was recognized here, so absolutely, yeah.
Is the tradition of giving a bomboniere at the weddings here, is that an Italian tradition that has come from over here, or is it from another country?
No, it's from Italy. I'm not really sure if it's also from other countries, but definitely it's an Italian. It's a tradition that we follow in Italy, and usually when the guests give the gifts to the bridal party, and then they receive a bomboniera, which is sometimes a small present. But what the main thing is that they have this almond coated, how do you call them? Sugar almonds, and they are a sort of a symbol of fertility. So, yeah, so we follow definitely that tradition. In fact, I think there are a few shops around Adelaide that sell them, and definitely the Italian community still keeps up with that tradition of the bomboniere.
I was amazed by the number of interviews you conducted. That's
I know.
Outstanding. Were they conducted in Italian or English, and what was the advantage of doing it one way or the other, did you find?
Yeah, so actually, when I told you the number of interviews I conducted, I didn't tell you the number of years it took me to do them. I've been working on the Calabrian community for 10 years. So it took me a lot. I had 2 children in the meantime as well, so I took my time. But yes, well, that's, I used oral history as a framework. So I reflected on my identity as well, because I'm an Italian who came here in about 13 years ago. So I interviewed the Calabrians in Italian, preferably. And what I realized is that they used Italian when they remember their youth, or when they remember their life in Caulonia. When they were talking about their experience here as market gardeners, they would speak in English. Sometimes they would use a lot of more English words. So it depended on the context. If they were retelling something they had done in Italy or here. So for only one person, I needed an interpreter because I'm not from Caulonia, and I don't speak the Caulognese or the Calabrian dialect. So I needed an interpreter because one of my interviewees only spoke the dialect, and I, in a sense, I felt that it was being Italian in Australia facilitated this process because I was sharing their own experience. I mean, 4 decades later, but still I was an Italian here. And when I went to Italy, I was an Italian in Italy. So it really it facilitated it, and I think that they felt very comfortable with that. And then some migrants chose to speak English, especially the migrants who came in the 50s and they were maybe 6, 8, 10 years old. So they preferred to speak English, definitely, for the whole interview. So it depended on their age, it depended on what they were telling me. So it was generally mostly Italian, but with a bit of a mixture.
Daniella, I've interviewed a few Italians in the Adelaide Hills, and being a non-Italian speaker and non-Italian background, it's, I won't say awkward, but only because they know me are they willing to sit down and talk. But for nearly all of them, I needed to have another Italian with me, who, this is the older ones like you're talking about, who could actually translate into Italian what I was asking them, or translate an answer back to me. Interesting process.
Yeah.
Did you tape your interviews?
Yes, I taped them. I've got lots of mini discs. Yes, and I had to transcribe them all. So it was, and then the interviews were not only conducted here, but in Mildura, in Perth, in Italy. I went twice to Italy, so it took a long time. And but yes, I had a good sample.
Rosa, could we have a quick thumbnail sketch of the saint, please?
Tell us about Saint Hilarion.
Saint Hilarion.
Yes. Oh, Saint Hilarion was known especially for the miracles that he performed. That's why he's venerated so much. And in particular, is important for the Caulognese because of the miracle of the rain. And it was a time when the Caulonia was going through a long period without rain, and they didn't have their crops, and they were really praying that it could rain, and eventually did rain. So they attributed this miracle to Saint Hilarion. And also when during the war, when the Allies, some of the Caulogneses said that they saw the image in the sky, in the clouds of Saint Hilarion after Italy was liberated from when the Allies went through the southern Italy. So this.
I'll take one more. Do you want to comment or?
The name Hilarion seems to me to have a Greek quality about it. Is it a Greek saint or a Greek-derived saint?
Well, it's he used to live in Palestine, and then he traveled a lot and went up in Dalmatia. Is that Dalmatia, the area of? He was and in Egypt, and then in Sicily and Calabria. So he traveled a lot and in Cyprus as well. Yeah.
Being a non-Italian married to a man from Caulonia, can I ask you in your interviews, How did you get them to stop talking?
Actually, the best part of my interview is that I never left. I have to admit that they've been so welcoming. Every Colonies I interviewed, whether it was in Mildura or Adelaide or Caulonia, I never left without a bag full of pomodori or lattuga or melanzane or sometimes le polpette. So they were really, really welcoming, yeah.
During World War II, as I understand it, in Australia, the Italians and others, the Germans and so on, were interned, or some of them were interned as threats to the nation. Did any of your subjects refer to any of those experiences?
Not so much as interned, but quite a few, the ones who came in the interwar period, were sent to labor camps, and they had to go and maybe cut wood in Mount Campus, is that? Mount Campus. And another person said that he was sent because he was a tailor. So he was sent to work in a factory that used to make uniforms for the Australian soldiers. Another one went to work in the salt fields. And in Perth, when I interviewed, actually, no, this interviewee was from Mildura, but he had come from Western Australia. He said that he was sent to Rottnest Island. And yeah, so he spent some time in this camp, and then went down to the Harvey camp. But no one I interviewed went to Barmera, to Loveday. Not the people I interviewed, but yes, definitely they were interned, a lot of them.
Well, thank you, Daniella. That's been a fascinating discussion, I've got to say. And the research you did, I'm just in awe. I know how long it takes to do oral histories and transcribing and getting the story out of people, so yeah, you've done a fantastic job.